Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing our series on Aristotle's Poetics, looking at what is mimesis. Now, mimesis is an ancient Greek term used to mean imitation, resemblance, or artistic representation. The term is important to the aesthetics of both Aristotle and Plato, as one of the purposes of art was to mimic the real world. Now, for Plato, mimesis is a central concept both to his theory of forms as well as his conception of art and artistic representation. For Plato, mimesis was a negatively coded term, meaning an inadequate imitation. In the way that the real world merely imitates the pure forms, poetry merely imitates life, and therefore is further from the truth, as we discussed in the first video. Despite Aristophanes' critique of Socrates in the Clouds, he and Plato actually did share kind of this negative coding of mimesis and this negative sense of mimicry and imitation and the art of the theater or the art of literature. Mimesis to Plato necessarily can only be a weaker version of what it imitates. So an imitation of an imitation is necessarily further from the truth. In this way, an imitation is only valuable if it is in fact mimicking something that is true or real, and the closer to that truth, the more valuable the imitation. Therefore, Plato doesn't care about how well you craft a story. All he cares about is what the initial story is and whether or not that story is true. Plato had no patience for rhetoricians and sophists who were very good at convincing people of things, but didn't have any idea of what was actually true or didn't care about the truth of the fact of the matter. Therefore, for Plato, the skill of convincing people of something, which he viewed as the skill of creating literature in the theater, was unimportant because it was completely separate from what really mattered, which was the truth of the content that they were imitating. For Aristotle, on the other hand, mimesis is much less negatively coded. It takes on the meaning of artistic representation. Aristotle also acknowledges a wider range of meanings beyond simple visual or auditory similarity. As we talked about in the last video, Plato's ideas of artistic beauty really were only about kind of paintings or sculptures, and story didn't really fit in there. But for Aristotle, music wasn't simply a mimicry of natural sounds or these things, but rather it could be mimetic of emotions that one feels when listening. And the same could be said of the stories or portrayals in drama. Aristotle also makes a distinction between different types of mimesis, representing things as they are, as they're believed to be, and as they should be. As we will see with comedy and tragedy, he also distinguishes between representing people as better than they are and as worse than they are. So Aristotle has kind of a much richer and more positively coded notion of mimesis than Plato did. Not that mimesis wasn't very important and central to Plato's theories, simply that he uses it more as a diminutive term, insulting things that are mimetic, rather than kind of this expansive idea of artistic representation. Additionally, with respect to the value of mimesis, Aristotle distinguishes between characteristics which make a piece of work valuable independently of its connection to truth. Remember, Plato only cared about our mimesis insofar as it was imitating the right thing. However, Aristotle says we can talk about something in terms of mimesis, in terms of how it imitates and the way that it imitates. And it can be good or better or more beautiful based on how it imitates something. If a play does a good job of imitating the emotions that we feel in life, we can talk about it as being good, even if it's not a direct, perfect representation of what the world is. Aristotle's Poetics represent exactly this distinction. Regardless of the truth of the content or values presented in the story, what makes the story a well-written story? Now, Aristotle does go a little bit into kind of the thought and the ideas that are present. He does talk about morals. He does talk about values and virtues within his Poetics, but he takes them as secondary to plot and character, which is the key difference between him and Plato. Plato says what matters is the content that you're imitating. Aristotle says to make a good play, you have to do it well, and that matters more than what you're imitating or what you're talking about. Now, later conception of arts have generally disproven that the sole purpose of art is mimesis, at least as a purely visual or auditory sense, through abstract painting and sculpture. One could argue that abstract painting and sculpture may be imitations of emotions in a certain way, an entirely red painting may be an imitation of an anger or something like that, an entirely blue painting might be sadness, blah, blah, blah. But the idea that they are purely mimetic in the sense of representing something that is out there exactly in the world, Jackson Pollock doesn't really do that in the very strict, literal sense of drawing someone's face or painting someone's picture. However, a great deal of art does remain mimetic and serves the purpose of mimicking or representing reality. As Aristotle argued, and many theoreticians of aesthetics think now, there are ways that we can mimic emotions or give rise to emotions, and therefore have art which is not directly mimicking the facts of the world, but giving rise to those emotions and therefore mimicking emotional states. Next up, we're going to start looking at some of Aristotle's distinctions between different kinds of poetry and different kinds of art. We'll look at Aristotle's mediums of art. He has 3 of these distinctions. The next 3 videos will delve into those 3 distinctions. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.